including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Associated Press news agency, were all reporting the shooter was a diplomat. They later admitted they did that at the request of the U.S. State Department, which said revealing Davis's CIA affiliation might put him at greater risk. The State Department asked the same of the British newspaper The Guardian. But given what was already public knowledge in Pakistan, The Guardian did not cooperate.
There were several emails backwards and forwards where the CIA presented their arguments, but in the end, our assessment really was that the safety threat to Davis was not linked to publication of any story. They were already burning his effigy in the streets, calling him a CIA agent. So really, it actually wasn't such a great secret at that point. There was also a sense that perhaps the CIA was using this safety argument as an excuse to have him released as a diplomat.
Once The Guardian published, U.S. media outlets stopped censoring themselves, reported that Davis was CIA, and explained to their readers why they had held that information back. The New York Times published some readers' letters critical of the decision. One said, "Yet again, the Times has shown itself to be a willing pawn of the government's propaganda ministry." The paper defended the decision through its public editor, who wrote the Times did the only thing it could do. But even he asked, how can a news outlet stay credible when readers learn later that it has concealed what it knows?
The New York Times fell in a real trap here. It's one thing if the New York Times learns about something happening abroad, say if somebody is kidnapped in a war zone and they simply don't report on it at all. But what the New York Times did is they tried to continue covering the story and publishing the statements from the US government saying he was only a diplomat, and ignoring or not giving much credence to reports in the Pakistani press that he was a CIA agent. So when you look back at these stories, they are misleading.
It was certainly gratuitous. It didn't fool anyone, but it also meant that any claim that the US government would then make from that point onward dubious, because they were in fact trying to use the media to conceal information about Mr. Davis. It simply doesn't work as a strategy.
Some media critics have saluted The Guardian for breaking the news embargo and provoking U.S. newspapers to follow. But would The Guardian have acted with the same independence had Davis been British, working for MI6 as opposed to the CIA?
When a government approaches a newspaper not to publish a story, there are two arguments it can make that are very powerful. One is that an individual's life is in danger. The other is that national security can be threatened. So it's very difficult to hypothetically say what would happen if a British intelligence agent was involved. But there's certainly no doubt that The Guardian would take those concerns very seriously and look at them on their merit.
U.S. officials feared Davis.
Because what news organizations in one country call a national security concern, the rest of the world's media just call news. And the moment Raymond Davis pulled the trigger in Lahore, he became a story, whether the CIA likes it or not. Our Global Village Voice is now on the reporting of the Raymond Davis story.
I think the concealment of this information by the New York Times and the Washington Post demonstrates that these U.S. media outlets place the interests of the United States government over the interests of the public and their right to know what their government is doing. I believe that any time journalism begins to serve a state power, whatever power that may be, that it ceases to be journalism and has begun to move into the realm of propaganda.
You will not find any report in US print or electronic media which will portray Pakistan's point of view. Please don't forget the common people in Pakistan's busy marketplaces nabbed Raymond Davis and handed him over to policing and judicial authorities. Well, this clears, at least in our point of view, that his life is not a threat from people or government of Pakistan.
Davis is a murder suspect and has entered the judicial process of Pakistan. His CIA status is very material to that case, and withholding it would show contempt for the process.
If you've got an opinion on the news media that you'd like to get on the air as one of our Global Village Voices, we suggest you join the thousands of our viewers who already follow us on Facebook and Twitter. They go to those sites to find out what stories we're working on so they can weigh in. Or you can just get in touch with us via email. We're at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The American soldier accused of leaking hundreds of thousands of documents to WikiLeaks has been charged with another 22 offenses, the most serious of which carries a possible death penalty. Among the new charges against Bradley Manning, who's being held in a military prison in Virginia, aiding the enemy. He's also accused of wrongfully causing intelligence to be published on the internet, multiple counts of theft of public records, and computer fraud. The aiding the enemy charge is the one that can be punishable by death, although the prosecution says it will not seek the death penalty. In the Manning case, that option would be open to the judge. As for WikiLeaks' own legal problems, a judge in the UK has ruled that the organization's frontman, Julian Assange, should be extradited to Sweden to face sexual assault accusations there. Assange's lawyers are appealing that ruling, saying that if Assange is extradited to Sweden, he could then be passed on to the US and face similar charges to Private Manning. The authorities in China do not want the protests that have swept through North Africa to take root in their country, and they're keying on the media to make sure that that doesn't happen. Demonstrations planned in 23 cities on the mainland and in Taiwan to kick off China's own Jasmine Revolution have been marked by sparse turnouts and instant clampdowns on journalists. Foreign reporters claim they were harassed, some said they were beaten, and a BBC News crew said it was bundled into a police van and forcibly removed from a demo. Local media were also targeted and probably face more serious consequences. As many as 100 Chinese bloggers and web activists were detained or preemptively put under house arrest prior to the protests. One of them, Ran Yunfei, a magazine writer and signatory of Charter 08, a manifesto that calls for political reform in the country, has reportedly been charged with subversion of state power for distributing information about the protests online. Journalists in Iraq are still paying the price for trying to report the news. They're calling February 25th a black day for media freedom in the country. A series of protests that Iraqis described as a day of rage descended into violence with 29 reported fatalities. There was also a catalog of attacks on journalists. Police raided a TV station, AlJazeera, which was filming the Baghdad demo from its own roof. 10 people were arrested there. A journalist was reportedly run over by a police car, and Muntazar al-Zaidi, the reporter famous for throwing his shoes at former U.S. President George Bush, was reportedly arrested as well. Media workers in Iraq have long accused Prime Minister al-Maliki of tolerating a climate of intimidation against journalists. They've announced that in response, they will refuse to cover al-Maliki, but it's hard to foresee them sticking to their guns on that. He is the Prime Minister, after all. 8 newspapers in the West African country of Ivory Coast have ceased publication because of what they call constant harassment from supporters of the disputed president. All of the newspapers involved are seen as pro-Alassane Ouattara papers. He was widely considered to have won the presidential elections in November last year. Ouattara says he beat the incumbent, Laurent Gbagbo, who refuses to relinquish power. In a joint statement, the owners of the papers denounced the, quote, imperious and serious threat that hangs over the private and independent press, which refuses to go along with the illegal acts of Laurent Gbagbo's government, unquote. The papers, which say they will remain closed until further notice, also slammed what they call persistent judicial and police harassment of their staff. They're saying that their journalists are in constant danger.